Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. I'll wait, as I always do, for a second for people to join us. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. Hi, Fiona. My name is Lorna. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 centres across the Highlands. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness. We have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Skye and Lochaber Archive Centre in Portree, and Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards the work of the service, then we're very, very grateful for that. Thank you so much for those of you who have been able to do that. We're continuing today with our theme of in January of archiving through the ages. Last week I spoke a bit about the development of the Highland Archive Service, the development of archives as a profession in Scotland, and the way in which our service has grown and developed over the decades. Really nice comments on the back of last week. I'm really, really glad that it was of use and of interest to people. I think sometimes it's really interesting to understand a bit more behind the scenes of how these services work, what's happening behind the scenes, who's doing what. So I'm really, really glad you enjoyed it. And I said last week that this week would be a sort of part 2. So we've got the buildings, we've got the staff. We talked about how we came through that process of opening a service, how we opened the 4 buildings. So now that we've got all that, this week I want to talk about the collections. What do we hold? How do we get them? How do we decide what we take in? What's the journey of an archive collection when it comes to us? What do we do with those collections? And then what do we not have? Now, I'm very, very conscious that for those of you who have been watching for the many, many weeks, we're nearly at the 100th episode. I've spoken a lot about the collection, so of course you'll know a huge amount about what we have and what we hold, and the stories that are in those collections. But I want to move this week higher than item level, if you know what I mean. So higher than the individual items that we hold, higher even than the collection levels that we hold, and talk about the types of records that we hold, how they come to us. So more of an archival view of the collections rather than a view of the stories that they contain, if you know what I mean. Okay, so records come to us in 3 different ways, usually. There are official records that come to us through ongoing agreements. So for us, this category covers the local authority records, the records of the Highland Council and the predecessors of the Highland Council as those records come to light if they haven't already done so. That is an ongoing relationship and an ongoing transfer process. And that it's because of that relationship that we hold the school records, the borough records, the poor relief, and so on. So records can come to us through an official agreement with an organisation or a body. And as I say, that's just an ongoing, continuing relationship where there's a process that the records go through to end up with us. Records can also come to us through what's called charge and superintendents. Now, if you remember last week, I spoke about the role of the keeper of the records and that fantastic title that I'm jealous of. Well, certain records can be released by the National Records of Scotland and other organisations like it, so Historic Environment Scotland, for example, back to the local area under the approval of the keeper of the records. So the keeper of the records can authorise things leaving those national bodies and being rehoused in the local area that they pertain to. And 3 of our archive centres hold records under that type of arrangement. And that includes all of our Church of Scotland records. Around 1,000 volumes are all held under charge and superintendents from the keeper of the records. So we have our local authority records coming in on a regular transfer basis. We have records coming under that special charge and superintendents agreement. And then the third type is we have privately deposited records. These are things that have been given to us for long-term preservation by families, by businesses, estates, clubs, social groups, whatever you can think of, really. And this is the category that some of our other big collections fall into. So, for instance, our Highland Health Board, NHS Highland records, the Northern Constabulary police records, and loads of others. And many of the ones that I've done specific Learn with Lornas on fall under that category. So, for instance, the Cameron of Lochiel collection, the Bailey of Dunedin, Duncan Macpherson collection, the Barragill Keith collection. So that's one from each of our offices that I've spoken about specifically. The examples I've given there are all big, substantial collections, but also under that category of privately deposited come things like one diary. We've got a collection that's just one photograph or one postcard. Anything that's given to us by an individual or by an organisation or a group or so on, privately deposited, falls under that category. And so the collections in our offices are incredibly varied in content, which I hope you've seen over the last couple of years. But they fall into those categories generally in terms of how we get the collections. And I think sometimes people hold things, they just don't know how they go about the process of taking something from their loft and giving it to an archive service. So I'm going to touch on that today as well. Now, given the breadth of subject matter, yes, including our favourite, the Diary of Malcolm Blaine, given the breadth of the subject matter that we hold, you might think that we accept absolutely anything that's given to us, but we absolutely don't. So what we take in and what we refuse and where those collections are housed is governed by a couple of different things. First of all, we have retention schedules. So the Highland Council and other organisations will have retention schedules in place. And that means that they're identifying as they go along, with the help of an archive service, what is of permanent worth and what isn't. And then what is of permanent worth is archived, and what is irrelevant material going forward will be destroyed. So that's one thing that governs what comes to us. The other thing is our own acquisitions policy, which we use to determine whether to accept a collection when it's offered to us. And incidentally, all of these policies I'm going to talk about are on our website if you want to have a look at them. And I know that people will probably think that policies sound incredibly boring, but I beg to differ, partly because I wrote some of them. So they are interesting, and they give an insight into what we do and why we do it. So I wanted to read you an extract from our acquisitions policy that explains our kind of Bible of governing rules as to whether we accept a collection or not when it's offered to us. So it reads like this. The Highland Archive Service will not split collections which overlap catchment areas. The main geographical source of origin will determine which of our centres is chosen as the place of deposit. The Highland Archive Service will not collect records which relate to areas which lie outside the agreed Highland boundaries. Such records will instead be referred to the appropriate record office. However, in certain circumstances, if such records form an integral part of a collection which has a Highland connection, they will be kept together and catalogue information provided to the other appropriate record offices. Acquisition priorities. Our acquisition priorities are to collect records which represent the interests and opinions of our community. Very broad word, community. Acquire records which are deemed to be of archival value from private individuals, families, businesses, institutions, and other organisations in order to increase the range and depth of the collections held by the Highland Archive Service. We will seek to transfer the records relating to the Highlands held by the National Records of Scotland to the appropriate archive centre under charge and superintendents, and we will ensure the transfer of non-current records considered suitable for permanent preservation, still held within the Council and High Life Highland to the appropriate archive centre. So I will come back and break this down in a second. Acquisition terms. Before acquiring records, the Highland Archive Service requires that all records be non-current and no longer used for business purposes. The material has a connection to the Highlands. The depositor has the authority to transfer the title of the material and signs a deposit agreement form. The material is unique and deemed to be of archival value, and the records are free of legal or excessive access restrictions. It goes on to say that the Highland Archive Service, as a matter of course, does not collect artefacts, three-dimensional objects, works of art, published works, or newspapers. Only where these items are integral to an art collection will we seek to keep that collection together. Artefacts will usually be directed to the appropriate museum or gallery, and published museum to the appropriate library. We're advising potential depositors. The Highland Archive Service will draw attention to the existence of other repositories of a similar or overlapping interest. And so some key points here, and I'm aware I've read out a long document that's kind of quite official sounding, but some key points there. References to those three methods by which we acquire records: the transfer of non-current records from the Highland Council and High Life Highland, transfer of records held by other organisations under charge and superintendents, and collection of records by private depositors. And also certain conditions that you've seen there in that policy. They have to be non-current, so we won't, if there's a business still operating using those records on a regular basis, then they won't be archived. They have to be connected to the Highlands. So someone might come and offer us something amazing from 1300, but if it relates to Glasgow, then we are not the place for it and we wouldn't take it. And also they need to have archival value. So there needs to be a long-term benefit or to the community of keeping that record. Now, as I say, if people come to us with things, no matter how exciting they are, with huge archival value, but they don't relate to the Highlands at all, then we would refer them elsewhere. We've never yet been faced by a situation where if you don't take it, it's going to be burned. I can't imagine what we would do in that situation. I can't imagine it would ever arise, because if it's not suitable to us, it will be suitable to somewhere else. And we have that ongoing agreement with other archive centres where we would refer to somewhere else. And most archives will have that. They will have a collecting policy or an acquisitions policy that outlines what their boundaries are in terms of what they accept into their collections. It might be geographical in the way that ours is. It might be the fact that they're a business archive, so everything they take has to relate to a certain business or one particular building or one particular family or so on. But there will be a boundary so that people aren't just accumulating things in an official archive that don't fit together. Now, you'll notice one thing in that policy that is not there. There is nothing there about it needing to be a high-profile person's collection or a big important business or documents from hundreds of years ago. People's individual personal papers, as long as they're connected to the Highlands, are as likely to be of interest and value as anything else. And I think sometimes that is something that's really, really hard to get across to people. They will say to us, even people who have done astonishing things have said to me, but my things won't be of any interest to anyone. Yeah, but yours is a typical life of this period, and therefore it absolutely is of importance to document and to keep. We actively collect archive material. So, last week I sort of looked back at collections from hundreds of years ago and how they've come to us, and you will have seen that if you're following our Facebook pages. Certainly the Highland Archive Centre Facebook page is working chronologically through some of our documents this month. So I've talked there about things that we've had for a long time, but we actively collect archive material in as well. And you may remember me saying probably hundreds of times over the course of this series that documents are always at risk at times of change. So it's important that we as archives generally are able to step in and protect archive material when there's a moment of change. So as I said last week, times of local government reorganisation, times that a business closes down, somebody passes away, all of those times, records are at risk of being destroyed or worth they're worth not being seen. So it's absolutely vital, therefore, that people, so that we actively collect, but also that people know that we exist so that they approach us rather than just throwing things away. And I'm seeing your comment there, Fiona, about rescuing photos from a wheelie bin and giving them to Ambala. It's absolutely vital that people know that archive services exist so that when they're faced with something that they go, do I just throw this away? At least they know that they can ask the question to somebody. And that's another reason why my role and all the outreach activity that we do across all the staff is so, so important, because it raises awareness of what we do hold, but also it makes people aware of us as a place of potential deposit. And I'll come back to that. But for now, say you approached us with a collection, you've got your local golf club minutes or your mum's diaries. What would happen if you came to us with that? Well, first of all, you would meet with one of our staff, probably an archivist, but it depends which office you contact. They would talk over the collection with you or the item with you and make sure that it fits into that acquisitions policy that I read through. They would then try and gather as much information from you as they could. So if there are photos in the collection, do you know who's in the photos? If there's a bundle of letters, do you know who wrote them? What were the names and the details of the people who wrote those letters? If it's a business collection, do you know what year the business started? Do you know what year the golf club opened? Whatever it is, we'd be trying to gather as much information as we possibly could. Now, you may know that information or you may know nothing about it, and that we have both. We have people who know a huge amount about the collections they give us and people who know nothing at all about them. But it's vital from our point of view that we gather as much information as possible at that stage, because it's our best bet. The person who is handing them to us is likely at that moment to know the most about them. And that brings me on to another of my constantly battered home points, that if you have photos and you know who's in them, please write it on them on the back in pencil, or put a list with it. We get a lot of photos with no names, and that's just sad because it means we've lost something of the content of them. So once we've acquired as much information as we can about a collection when someone's offering it to us, if it fits into that acquisitions policy, we would then formally sign it over to us. That can either be as a gift or as a long-term deposit. A gift means that we would take over the kind of, not in every situation, but often the copyright of it and be able to use it in whichever way we see fit. If it's a long-term deposit, then the person would retain ownership but allow us to use it. Restrictions would be discussed at that point as well. So if you had, for instance, if you wanted to give, try and think of an example. If you wanted to give your diaries in, but you knew you had written some things that maybe you didn't want people to read for the next 50 years or so, then you can put that restriction onto them at that point. We really try and keep that to a minimum because we want the collection to be as usable as possible. But also, we will apply closures where we see fit. So, for instance, things like GDPR, data protection, we would put on a restriction if we thought that was at risk. And so the depositor retains a copy of that agreement, and so do we. So the collection has now been accessioned, and initially it will be box listed by our staff. So that means we would do a general, broad list of what's contained in each box, just so we've got an overview of what the collection contains before it's fully catalogued. Now, the cataloguing process is undertaken by all of our staff. All our staff will catalogue. Things are put into order or kept in the original order if that is appropriate. It really depends how the collections come to us. If things have come in a way that if they've been found basically in a big heap in an attic, then we would impose an order on that because they've just come as a mess. But if they've come with an order that seems to have been for a reason, then we would keep that. The items will be numbered, so they will either be item numbered or bundle numbered, described, listed, and shelved. So by that point, we have complete control over the collection, what's in it, and where it sits within a logical order. At that point, the list would be made available to the public and to our staff to access as well. And it can take some time to catalogue a collection. We have collections that are hundreds and hundreds of pages with thousands and thousands of items. So it can take a long time to catalogue a collection and make it accessible. It's also at that point when it's been accessioned that it will be checked over by our conservation team. So it may be that there's mold in the collection. If it's been found in a basement, there may be little creatures or something found in it. At that point, the conservation team will step in and ensure that the fabric of the collection is secure to go on. So once we've got to that stage, we've accessioned it, we've catalogued it, how then do we give access to it? The details of this can be found in our access policy. It's a good one, she says, written on our website. Interesting, Leslie, you were asking there about, has the definition of community changed as a result of Learn with Lorna? It's a really interesting question. I think the word community is so very, very broad of the people who are interested, and so too is the word access. How do we give access? So this is the next thing I want to talk about. There are a variety of ways that we think about and consider providing access to our collections. Public access to the collections is absolutely fundamental to what we do. It's in our vision and mission statement. And I want to read the vision and mission statement to you to see, so you can see our overarching aim. The Highland Archive Service collects, conserves and makes accessible records which reflect the history and diversity of the Scottish Highlands and its inhabitants for the benefit of present and future generations. We promote the use of these records to inform local decision-making, strengthen community and cultural identity, and promote well-being through the study and enjoyment of history. We aim to make the collections in our care as widely accessible as possible in the welcoming and inclusive search rooms in our archive centres, through digital channels, and through an active community engagement programme, enhancing opportunities in culture, leisure, learning, health, and well-being. So you can see there that access has many, it's many-stranded. So there's the physical access to documents in our search rooms. There are the digital channels. There's the community engagement programme. There's things like Learn with Lorna. All of these broaden the access to a broader community. We're trying to make the collections as widely available in some capacity to as wide a range of people as we can. And cataloguing them, of course, is key to that. That's stage one. If we don't accession and catalogue the collections, there will be no access in any format to them. And then providing those lists for our search room and our online catalogue gives access. It means that people can either look through the collections in person or they can get us to look. We have a remote inquiry service. So if you can't get into our archive centres for whatever reason, then you can contact us and we can do that for you. We share images from our collections via blogs, websites, online exhibitions, social media pages, Ambala. We share knowledge through training sessions. We do training sessions with various other archive professionals or volunteers, and we run series of classes. We've got our new series coming up in a couple of weeks. We share stories in the collections through talks, through projects, and through things like Learn with Lorna. We're sharing the content of the stories of those collections through things like this. So that's one side of access. We're providing a conduit between people and the information contained in the collections. But there are so many other things we have to consider about giving access to our collections. So when we give physical access to items in our search rooms, then we need to consider things like the long-term strain on those items. We have to consider access versus preservation. So do we provide digital surrogates of things so that repetitive use of a document isn't going to cause damage and then take away the access? We have to consider the conservation requirements. Is handling something too much going to cause a weakness in it and damage it? So it's a balance there of our duty of care to the documents. That is our fundamental purpose, is to look after and preserve those documents, but balance that with the need to give access to them, which is also very central to what we do. So that's one thing. Another thing that we need to consider is the risk involved in interpreting the documents to assist access. So you will have heard me say many, many times, um, I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert on this subject, this is my take on this document. And it is something I try incredibly hard to do, which is to be neutral and to let the document stand on its own feet, while still being empathetic about the content that that document contains and sharing the story that's within it. It's a really difficult balance, but some of the greatest compliments for me that I have received from this service have been relating to achieving that balance, to not um, over interpreting the content of the document. So that's something else we have to consider. We are well aware that things like this and things like providing captions to documents and um, we produce storyboards and things where we will share the story of a document, things like that massively help people access the collections. But we have to be very conscious of not putting our own interpretation onto that. So that's something we have to consider when giving access as well. And then there's the huge challenge of giving access to different formats. And that's where I got today's title from parchment to portals. Because as an archive service, we deal with documents on parchment, so animal skin, on paper. We have photographs, we have reel-to-reel tapes, cassette tapes, videos, microfilm, microfiche, glass plate negatives, wax seals, cine films, DVDs, MP3 files, mini discs, floppy disks, pen drives, slides. I could go on and on and on. Um, there are so many formats that we have within our collections, and each type of those come with their own access challenge, some more than others, but also with their own conservation challenges, because different inks, different papers react differently across the centuries. And so we need to upkeep those methods of access. So for instance, we have microfilm and microfiche readers in our search rooms. And we have to ensure that wherever possible, different formats are kept in the appropriate location. So for instance, at Hark, where I'm based in Inverness, we're fortunate to be able to keep audio-visual material separate. We don't have that luxury in all of our offices, and certainly not in all archives in the country. But what we do is keep them in the best conditions that we can. We need to handle those collections with care. And contrary to popular opinion, here's another myth bust for the series. We very rarely wear white gloves. Um, But one thing we always do is we always wear nitrile thin gloves with photographs, because the fingerprints will never come out otherwise. So those sorts of things are involved in access. When we give people access, how do we do it in the best way for them and the best way for the document? Our biggest challenge as a profession right now is the issue of digital preservation. So storing, preserving, and giving access to material that was born digital. So not just things that have been created in another format and then digitized, but things that have never existed in any other format. They were created digitally. That needs a whole different sort of strong room around it, effectively. It needs different sorts of protection, different means of access, and different upkeep to ensure its long-term preservation. Because if you think we have all, I would imagine, I have, even though I work in this profession, I have lost old photos on an old phone. You've lost documents because the, you know, Windows or whatever program updated and you didn't get there in time to save things. So all of those things need to be considered when we're accessioning digital material. And that's a challenge that's facing all archive services at the moment. And we are very, very fortunate at Highland that we are in the position, we're in the process of appointing a dedicated digital archivist to work on those issues. And we also have a dedicated digital preservation policy to look at how we can do that to best ensure that we give the same level of care and protection and long-term safety to digital records. And so that's it, access. Access is many-stranded as well, much like communities. But I find it really exciting. I find it really exciting to think of the ways we can share the collections, we can bring the collections in and connect people to them. Now, so far for today and for the last couple of years, I've focused on the collections that we hold. how they come to us, the process they undergo when they come to us to become usable, how we enable access through things like events and talks and projects and social media pages and websites and all sorts of things, and how we protect those collections. But I want to finish today by giving some examples of things we don't have in our collections and why it matters that we don't have them and what we're doing about it. There are certain voices which are prominent in the collections, and there are certain voices which are less well represented. Some of this is historic. So, for instance, for many, many years, only a certain sector of society, usually men, usually white men, usually white middle class men, would sit in the Kirk session, would sit on the town council, would sit on business boards, and so on. So some of those voices inevitably are more prominent in the collections. So that's one issue, and we need to work out how best to catalogue with that imbalance in mind. So we want it to be clear that just because a certain voice is being heard more doesn't mean the other voices weren't present. So that's one thing we need to keep in mind when we're cataloguing. But what about the other part of our role? We don't just collect the past, we collect the present for the future when it is the past. So we are very, 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 very aware that although our collections are incredibly broad, and I really hope Lorna over the last 94 episodes has showcased that, they're very broad, they're very wide ranging. They don't contain all the wealth of voices that lived and live in the Highlands. So, for instance, an example, we hold extensive Church of Scotland records in our collections, but relatively little about other denominations and other faiths, and yet those communities are part of the Highland landscape. So it's important to us that we accurately reflect current life in the Highlands. There are geographical areas within our catchment area that are less well represented in our collections. We have a number of wonderful business collections, which I've spoken about before, but it would be great to have more so that we can tell the story and better represent the range of local businesses that exist across the area. We have some, but we would love to have more sporting and hobby collections. You've heard me speak about football collections and shinty. We have very, very little about golf or rugby or others. It was lovely, lovely to me speaking about some of my favourite things that have come back to me as a result of Learn with Lorna. It was lovely after the football one to be approached at Nucleus with a gentleman who had sporting collections. So there are gaps in our collections, and we are well aware of it. We have very, very few voices of the so-called minority communities, so LGBTQ plus communities, for example, or people of colour. And again, it's absolutely vital that when people look back at our collections in the future, they are representative of what the Highlands is. Now, we're never going to capture all those voices and all those experiences, and we need to. It's absolutely vital. I believe this very strongly. What we do capture needs to be meaningful and not a tick box exercise. And all of that comes with challenges. So, as a result of that, there are various things we can do. We have a collections development policy, which states in it that we will continue to review the strengths and weaknesses of our collections, seeking to target areas of the collections which may be underrepresented and adding to the collections to reflect all aspects of life in the Highlands. And to do that, there are various things. We can directly reach out to groups and individuals, raise awareness of the service, of what we do through things like this, through things like Learn with Lorna. I know for a fact that there are people who have watched this who have never been into an archive centre before or wouldn't have known what we did. I know that people have engaged with, for instance, interviews that my colleague Catherine in Skye has done on the radio, or the blogs that Nucleus have put up, who haven't engaged with archives before. And so all of that is really, really vital in making people understand what we do and why what we do matters. So you can see that it's a sort of ongoing, self-perpetuating circle that collections are brought in, they're catalogued, they're shared and accessed, they're used in outreach and community events, which then raises awareness and brings in collections, and it's a constant cycle. And then they come into us where they can be looked after correctly and treasured and appreciated and shared. And the collections then can help people to learn about our past and also to think about what our future is and what we want our future to be. And this is where you can help. You may remember last week I said I'm going to use these 2 sessions to talk about how you can help us. Please spread the word about who we are and what we do as an archive service and as a profession of archiving. If you're a member of a club or a business, or you've got somebody's letters in your attic and you think there's anything that is of historic value, please contact us. Please just contact us for a chat about what you've got, to see if there's a way forward with that. It's absolutely vital that people know that things have value. I hope you've enjoyed the second kind of half of behind the scenes look at the service. I've thoroughly enjoyed these 2. This is my kind of bread and butter. This is what I do every day out with Lorna, is think about these things and ways to connect people to the collections. So I've thoroughly enjoyed these 2 weeks. Next week, I'm going to do a case study. I'm going to look at how we can trace the story of one school across centuries. So I'm working on a project at the moment, I've mentioned it before, with Central Primary School. It's their 200th anniversary. In order to trace the history of that school, I had to use a real range of collections. So private collections, borough records, official school records, to try and build a picture. So how do we look across those collections that have come to us over time and use them to build a picture of one institution? And then how are we sharing that? And how are we collecting the present of that school for the future? So next week, I'll be looking at the story of Central School, and then I'll go on to speak about Ambala, and that will be our final January one. So I hope you can join me next week. Thank you for joining me this week. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate either a financial donation towards our work or a donation of a collection that is relevant to us, then please do be in touch with us. Thank you so much.